Hey everybody, welcome to the show. If you listened for a while, well, you know a couple things. You know that usually there's 2 shows a week. One is an interview like this, and one is a live coaching call, unscripted, unedited, unproduced, just me getting on totally cold with someone and having a really beautiful conversation. And you'll also probably know that I am passionate about healing on every aspect and often pursue more alternative, you could say, modalities when it comes to healing. And today's conversation is about psychedelics when it comes to mental health and healing trauma. And I say this within the show, but I want to say it here. It's definitely something that should be pursued with a qualified practitioner only. And the conversation that I have today is with someone who is intensely qualified and has a lot of experience in this world. So I never recommend, especially if you've got trauma, people just going off on their own and using psychedelics. I think it's incredibly important to be held in a really safe container and to have an integration process afterwards. I also mentioned microdosing, and I'm going to be actually doing another interview with someone who's an expert in microdosing, because I have really fallen in love with a company called Golden Rule that offers various microdosing products. And you'll learn a little bit more about that when I have Tiffany on the show. But it's been part of my support system, especially during times of stress or lack of sleep. And I've also learned how to work with different mushrooms and different strains on a very microdose level, like microdose. And it's just another tool in my toolbox, as is meditation and nervous system work and somatic work and having time with my friends and being in nature and being with my family and so on. So if you are already somebody that's gone down the microdosing path or you're a little interested in it, Golden Rule offers a lot of information on their site. You can check it out if you go to christinehassler.com/micro. You can check out their products, and you also get a little discount code if you order through my link there. But again, heads up for that conversation with Tiffany. We're going to talk a little bit more about microdosing and how potentially it could be a tool in your toolbox. Let me tell you a little bit more about my guest today. Today, I am joined by Keith Kurlander. He is the co-founder of the Integrative Psychiatry Institute and the Integrative Psychiatry Centers, which offer a grounded science-based look at how psychedelic-assisted therapies can offer the root causes of suffering where traditional approaches may fall short. With decades of clinical experience and cutting-edge research, Keith and his partner Will show why so many people feel stuck in the current system and what a more holistic trauma-informed path to healing can look like. They co-authored a book called The Psychedelic Therapy, a revolutionary approach to restoring your mental health and reclaiming your life. Keith is also a psychotherapist, but works today as a coach, helping people really have a life that they enjoy living and feel peaceful living and actually can live in the present, which we talk about a little bit more in the interview. And I just want to remind everybody, nothing said on this show is medical advice. This is for entertainment purposes only. All right, and now on to my conversation with Keith Kurlander. Keith, welcome to the show. I'm so happy to have you here.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
I love talking to people about mental health because it's an issue that's been something I struggled with at a very young age. I actually was put on Prozac when I was 11. And that was kind of started a cascade of antidepressants, some benzos, until my late 20s when I, found different paths to keep my mental health healthy. And I feel like it's an area where there's a lot of myths and there's a lot of misunderstandings. And we're really just starting to have a more comprehensive understanding of mental health and treatment approach. And I find that most people that are passionate about this kind of work usually have a personal story behind it. So I'm wondering what yours is.
Well, similarly, I was put on Paxil, which came right after Prozac and benzos at age 19. But my story kicks off at age 19 prior to those medicines where I did psilocybin for the first time. And I was in University of Massachusetts, Amherst, there's high rises there for dorms, 20 plus stories. And I was something like the 19th floor, and I left my friends. I was on psilocybin. And then all of a sudden I got very overwhelmed in my dorm room and started feeling just deep despair and started becoming aware of like, I've always felt this way. My life is, I've been suffering so much for so long in my life. And I can finally like just admit it to myself. And then I proceeded to go over to the window to deciding that I was going to jump out.
Wow.
And so I got over the window and I was pretty convinced this was the only option to deal with what I had been feeling. Then I hallucinated my 5-year-old sister, who was, a real person. And she started yelling at me not to do it, that she needs me. If I can't deal with this, she needs me. And so then I proceeded to crawl back into my bed and held on for dear life for a night. And then that triggered very significant mental health struggles that I had to figure out, that took decades to figure out. And so my story is both a personal and professional pursuit. I'm trained as a psychotherapist. I do a lot of coaching. And so I had to figure this out for myself and, something meaningful to bring to the people I was working with. So that's the story that got me here.
So sure, this is not an easy answer, but what really got you from wanting to jump out the window? Obviously, the hallucination of your younger sister was a piece of it, but obviously you found a fulfilling path. What were some of the things that really helped you? Because I know so many people, once mental health starts to suffer, it's really hard to pull out of that. You might have blips, but to pull out of it and really create a path forward can be really challenging. So what were the tools or resources that were most useful to you?
I committed to myself that I was either going to figure this out or I was probably going to not make it at some point. So I knew I was committing to trying to figure it out as I got away from the window. And then it was a number of things over time, but one of the big things that happened for me was that I swore I was never touching psychedelics again, but I swore that I was never doing a lot of things again in my life. I keep doing the things I keep telling myself not to do. But
I'm sure no one can relate to that.
Right. Yeah, like every day. So in my 30s, I got involved with an ayahuasca church as part of, again, like healing. And I was a very spiritual person. And what happened is that I started getting pretty unwound again. The experiences were always, similar for me, just very overwhelming. And anyways, I had already done hundreds and hundreds of hours of therapy. I had been under psychiatry, as we talked about in the beginning here. I was a professional psychotherapist. And at that point, I had already been, this is mid-30s, it was already, probably 15 years into doing a lot of work. But no one ever told me I was dealing with severe trauma. And it wasn't, trauma psychology was still kind of emerging
Trauma
at that
from
time.
Your childhood?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I was face down on the beach in Colombia with some indigenous elders. And I was like, my life is, I can't keep doing this. It's so bad. I don't know what's wrong with me. And one of the elders took me aside and we were in a hammock and he's like smoking a cigarette. And he says, look, the medicine is telling me that you just have childhood trauma and you need to deal with it. And it was the first time someone told me that. I have worked with, so I was a professional, psychotherapist, and I never really labeled it that way. And that was one of the main things that helped me, was like, once I kind of knew one of the main things I needed to point the ship toward around healing, that helped a lot. So I would say in terms of understanding, that was a big one.
Yeah, that's huge. And, I'm sure you haven't had a chance to listen to the show, but I also coach people on the air, and pretty much we trace everything back to childhood. And I'm super passionate about inner child work and rewiring the brain and, nervous system, which obviously includes the brain. Oh. And it's just such a big piece. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that, like how exactly, even if people Well, I think it's good to remind people trauma exists on a spectrum, right? Like, sometimes when we think of trauma, we think maybe we didn't have any because we weren't abandoned or weren't abused or something like that. So maybe you can kind of start with giving an overview of like what childhood trauma can include and how do we know if it's impacting us today.
Right. Well, I think the first piece of it is to just define trauma. So I'll start there, the way I use it. So trauma is a term, a psychological trauma is a term that's describing the state of your nervous system. It's not describing an event. It's not, that there are other terms for that, such as like complex trauma. That's actually describing an event, acute trauma, religious trauma, spiritual trauma. These are describing events. But the actual existence of trauma inside a person is a state of the nervous system. And that state of the nervous system is essentially that we have a threat response system that most people know this, like fight, flight, freeze, collapse. And that's there to, protect the species, to survive the organism. And as humans, that threat response system is obviously gets very complex around what is a threat and what isn't because of, our social structures and all kinds of things. So it gets very complex. But what happens is if there's an event that we get exposed to, or a number of events where the nervous system gets triggered into the threat response and it doesn't resolve the threat, then the nervous system gets stuck there. And so the nervous system stays in out of the homeostatic state. It doesn't return to it. And the threat response starts triggering when there's no threat. And so then we have a nervous system that's, either hyperactive or hypoactive based on those responses. So once that happens, here we are. And that looks like such a wide spectrum of what it could look like to the person. It could look like PTSD, which is a very specific set of symptoms, post-traumatic stress disorder, flashbacks, and all kinds of things like that, agitation. And it can also look like irritable bowel syndrome sometimes. It could look like chronic fatigue. It could look, all kinds of things, all kinds of dysregulation in the body, chronic inflammation. There's tons of studies that show that trauma and inflammation are linked. So what it looks like is varied, and that's where a really good practitioner is helpful. In terms of what is childhood trauma, like if we talk about what are the likely causes of childhood trauma, I mean, the biggest thing to be aware of is like complex developmental trauma, because a lot of people experience it and don't know it, where either you're feeling chronically misattuned to as a child. There's a lot of maybe spectrum of violence in the house, whether that's yelling or more severe. That's, terrifying to a child.
Yeah.
It could obviously be bullying and all kinds of things, but usually it's misattunement that causes a lot of developmental trauma. And there's a lot of that on this planet. There's a lot of, parenting is not, as we know as parents, we talked about this as we were coming on, like it's actually not simple. And, you're like trying to do your best, and it's actually hard to do it well. It's the modern world of parenting is tricky. So that's what I would say.
It really is. We could do a whole nother podcast on that alone.
Right.
And especially, I don't know about you, like as a professional with so much developmental psychology training, I even put more pressure on myself because like I know how important it is. And I'm also so quickly humbled that even with all my training and all my knowledge, it's still like,
Totally. I'm like, every day I'm like, did I just screw up my kid?
Oh my gosh. Yep.
And it's like, and then it's confusing. But we also know you actually don't have to get it right even a majority of the time, but you do have to get it right like 30 to 40% of the time in terms of like healthy attachment. So the bar isn't that high, but for our modern world, that's already pretty high.
Yeah. And I think, our parents really didn't have access to the kind of knowledge that we have now. And I do really feel like we're in such a generational pattern breaking cycle right now as parents.
Yeah.
which is exciting. And, I've been doing what I do for 22 years, and gosh, probably very similar to you, the stories I've heard about what people have been through in childhood. I mean, it's appalling. It's
Yeah.
truly, truly appalling, especially now as a parent myself. And so I guess what is a good question to go to from here is, when someone has that much childhood trauma, or even that much for them, right? Like, we're not going to measure this on a scale. We're just going to talk about you individually, that really feels like it just has ruined their life. Is there a way out? Or are you kind of just slightly damaged for the rest of your life?
You're definitely not damaged for the rest of your life. You have an injury,
Right.
that needs to be attended to.
Right. And I think I want to pause there, because that is
Yeah.
such an important point. It's not just a memory. Trauma affects our brain, our cells, our biology, like everything you said about inflammation and how it shows up in the body. So it has a profound effect on us, not just emotionally, but physiologically, which is why, mental health, it's at the root of so much physical health as well. So anyway, sorry to interrupt you, but I just
No,
wanted to make
totally.
sure.
I totally agree with that. And trauma is a disorder of presence. Trauma is embedded in the body. It's held in the body because of our memory system in the brain that trickles through the whole body. But it's a disorder of presence. You're essentially, your brain is stuck in the past, versus the present, right? So that's an important, with the question of like, are you kind of screwed for life? It's actually, the present is going to be totally fine if you can get to it.
Yes.
So you're not screwed. Actually, there's lots of beauty around you and opportunity in your world, but you have to be able to get present to see it. Because when you're really traumatized, obviously, when you look through that person's eyes, that's not what they see, because they're not seeing the present world, they're seeing the past, and they're stuck there. So the journey is, you're making a journey from the past to the present when you heal trauma, is what you're doing.
Yeah. I think that's what's so hard about living with a traumatized nervous system, is you time travel so much. You can be in a completely safe environment in the present day, but your body can think that you're in your house when you were 5 and your parents were throwing things at each other. It's just
totally.
your brain can get hijacked so quickly, which is why treating trauma at the level of the brain and nervous system is such a useful tool. And this is where something you're passionate about, and something that has been helpful to me as well in therapeutic, not party settings, is psychedelic work. Can we talk about first what psychedelics are? Because, for some people, they may think this is what you do. This is what you did in Woodstock, for people that are younger than us in Coachella or something.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Well, psychedelics, when we talk about psychedelic therapy, when we use the term psychedelics, we're talking about a range of substances that, from a science definition, don't all necessarily meet the definition of what's called classical psychedelics. Classical psychedelics interact with certain receptors in the brain, the 5-HT2A receptors. They're serotonin receptors. And those are like LSD, psilocybin. But when we talk about psychedelic therapy, and now the term psychedelic, we're including a much broader class of substances that induce a psychedelic experience. And that's like ketamine and MDMA, psilocybin, DMT, peyote. There's lots of different substances. Some of those are classical psychedelics. So we're really talking about it induces a non-ordinary state of consciousness, and those are psychedelic substances. And then psychedelic therapy, when you pair the term therapy with it, this is where, it's not Woodstock, but well, maybe some people left there with therapy. Some people did not. Yeah. So then you're pairing it with therapy. So there's usually a therapist with you before, during, and after the experience, with stages of treatment that make it a therapeutic process.
When did it really become more known that psychedelic therapy can be helpful in treating trauma? And how does it work? How does it actually help someone treat trauma and get more into the present moment?
So psychedelics have an interesting profile. They all work a little differently, but they all seem to do something interesting, which is that they often somewhat reliably they express what's in the nervous system. And so if there's trauma, if the nervous system's in a state of dysregulation, psychedelics will often express that in a way where, and so not only does it get expressed, obviously it gets expressed when you have PTSD or other trauma, you'll feel the traumatic response here and there, but it gets expressed, but then you also are in a non-ordinary state of consciousness, and depending on the medicine, you start looking at it from a different perspective. Sometimes you make associations around what this experience feels like to origin memories that you forgot. And again, depending on the medicine, it allows you often to start to resolve those things that sometimes were entrenched for decades and nothing else worked. So there's different aspects of how that works. I mean, MDMA is what's primarily studied for trauma, but all psychedelics seem to kind of stoke that fire in different ways. There's also other things that can happen that help resolve trauma, like you may not actually experience the trauma itself, but you may get in touch with a profound self-love that you never had before.
Yeah.
You might have a mystical experience of not being alone that you never had before. So there's different components of how it happens.
Do you think, or based on your experience, can trauma be resolved through talk therapy alone?
I think it depends on, I would say anything could be resolved with anything. So potentially, for sure. But for very complex trauma, I mean, talk therapy isn't typically alone. Just talk therapy isn't typically the main go-to for trauma treatment these days anyways.
Yeah.
There are cognitive methods that can resolve some traumas, but very complex trauma, I would say no, not typically. Like you need some other help, whether it's somatic work or whatever.
Yep.
And then there's traumas that just won't let up. Like the nervous system just isn't getting better. And that's, where things like psychedelic therapy come into play. It's just not happening.
Yeah. I completely agree with you. And unfortunately, a lot of people can't afford different types of therapy. Maybe their insurance covers counseling or, more traditional talk therapy, which is definitely better than nothing. It can be really useful. But I have found if you don't bring in the body, which obviously includes the nervous system, it's really hard just to talk it away. And there's often other modalities that really are required. So let's talk a little bit more about psychedelics and about when they can be or who they can be most useful for. And if someone has, tried a lot of different things, because I'm thinking of myself in my early 30s when I started to explore for therapeutic reasons, psychedelic. I had never ever smoked a joint. Like I had maybe puffed a cigarette. Drugs were really scary to me because I didn't want my brain to break. I was so afraid of my brain breaking because it was where I felt I had control in a very uncertain world. So sorry, I'm saying a lot here. There's
keep going.
There's sort of two questions in this.
Yeah.
I want to address the fears around psychedelics and the whole brain breaking thing, because I'm sure most people listening have heard a story of someone overdosing or someone having a bad experience. So there is that reality. And then also, how do you know when you're a candidate? And then we can kind of unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, I'm a story of someone who, like, if you didn't know any better, you could say his brain broke.
Yeah.
But I know better now. So I would say, I mean, at the very beginning of this, psychedelic therapy isn't right for everyone. There are certain conditions that don't play well with psychedelic therapy. Anybody that has psychotic symptoms and things, that doesn't play well with psychedelic therapy, particularly if it's a psychotic disorder that's causing them. Sometimes you have to be a little careful if you had a some family members close to you that had severe psychotic disorders, like, and you're already pretty unstable, like you could have an emerging psychotic disorder waiting for a stressor for it to emerge. So there are things like that. There's some medical things based on the different medicine. But generally speaking, it can be a good fit for a lot of people. And then again, it depends on which medicine we're talking about. But in terms of like your brain breaking, which again, I'm sort of the poster child of, did that happen? I think often, so one thing could happen is you take too much medicine. That's real. And you could just get so overwhelmed. Your nervous system could just get so overwhelmed because you just took too much. Maybe you had a different type of metabolism and you were a slow metabolizer and you don't need as much as the next person and you took too much even though you thought you took the right dose, right? So there is that. But let's say you were able to take the right dose for yourself, then yeah, you could get overwhelmed because you maybe have trauma, or maybe you just have a scary non-dual experience that you have to integrate. But I would say for the most part, when you look at the research, it goes fairly well. People's brains aren't breaking in the research. There is a disorder, we don't know the percentage, but it's pretty uncommon, HPPD, hallucinogen persistent perceptual disorder. It's basically like the flashback thing, but it's pretty uncommon and it typically goes away. But if you have the right team, I would say psychedelic therapy is a profound intervention that might feel really hard, but with the right team, you might actually, you're more likely to grow from it. And, healing is not easy. Like, whether it's psychedelics or whatever you're going to go do to get over this stuff, like, it's not going to be easy work. The easy path is trying to ignore it and just suffering along the way.
Yeah.
Anyways, so, yeah.
And for people, a good start. So Keith has a book that he co-wrote. You co-authored this book, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
With Will Vanderveer, yeah.
Yes, called Psychedelic Therapy, a revolutionary approach to restoring your mental health and reclaiming your life. So if you're like, oh, maybe this is interesting, educate yourself. I mean, I really empower anybody listening. Really educate yourself. There's no magic pill, literally. But the more educated you are, for me at least, the less fear I had going into psychedelic experiences. And I also want to emphasize, and I will get on my soapbox about this. I'm curious what you have to say, Keith. I've lived in communities where every weekend someone's doing a journey. Someone's having a medicine. And at some point, I'm like, okay, you're doing drugs at this point. Like you've gone beyond this being a therapeutic tool to now you're addicted to this, right? So I would love to talk a little bit about the line between psychedelics as a therapeutic usage versus another addiction and distraction from dealing with your stuff. And in addition, the importance of therapeutic integration after you have a psychedelic experience, not just having an experience and then be left to your own devices to process what just came up for you there.
I would say most people that are overusing psychedelics, but still have the framework that it's their healing. And I'm not going to say what number that is because it's different for everyone. What amount is overusing? I can't just say that.
Yeah.
Well, I can't just say that. Like everybody's situation is different. But most of the people that are doing that are doing it under a spiritual framework of healing. They're not doing it under like a Western psychotherapy lens. So doing under a spiritual framework of healing, and the framework is like usually like, well, I'm working through my stuff, but like if I get more centered over time in these psychedelic journeys, I'm making progress.
Right.
Like that's kind of the framework. If I could hold my seat better over time, I'm making progress basically. And I think that often, not always, often there's an escapism from the ordinary consciousness reality of like, it's actually hard to love your life as is and to be in the present with what is. And that's the hard work. And so some people are returning to psychedelics a lot, like you said, almost as an addiction. It's escapism because not just the experience, but often what happens in psychedelic journeys is there's very big ahas and
Right.
kind of magical moments. And people return to those as if that aha is happening for the first time, and it hasn't.
Right.
They're not integrating it. So they keep going back for more because they're not integrating it. So
Right.
I think that's the trap. That's the
Yep.
spiritual trap. It's not, there's also obviously spiritual progress that can happen, but that's the trap I think you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah, and I've seen it a lot, and I've had a lot of people come to me after they have these incredible experiences, and then they just don't know what to do with it. And I'm like, okay, now we need to bridge it. We need to bring this
Yeah.
into your daily life. I mean, I can still think back to my very first psychedelic experience with 5-MAO, and
Mhm.
I can still tap into the reference point of the
Yeah,
profound unconditional love that I felt there.
totally.
And the growth for me is to use it as a reference point, not to need the drug to get back to that. And I think that's
Yeah.
where psychedelics can be so useful. It can be like, here's an experience so you know what it feels like. So I think for so many of us, we have disconnected from God. We have forgotten what that unconditional love and oneness feels like. But it's not something to learn, it's truly something to remember. And when we can remember that, it's like, oh, wait, okay, like I have a touch point for it. So it's been a huge piece for my mental health journey in terms of resolving
Yeah.
my own trauma. But it's also been, like you alluded to, such a profound experience for me spiritually as well.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think, and what you're talking about, like that's the magic, that you're talking about of psychedelic therapy. That's where, or psychedelic use, when it turns into that, what you're describing is like, that's where people's lives are changed.
Yeah.
They can get back in touch with the wholeness within them that
Yeah.
already exists, potentially get in touch with an interconnectivity with the
Yeah.
divine. And that's amazing. And that's, I think, integration work is key there. And then on the flip side of that, and this is where I think there is cognitive tools and the cognitive somatic tools. The thing with psychedelics that I was talking a little bit about is like you also can create new splits in yourself where
Mm,
you go into pride or shame or elation or depression during psychedelic events that have to actually get integrated also. And so that's a whole nother part of the work that's subtle. Not saying that you're going to find a guide that's going to be able to do that aspect with you because it's a very subtle work, but it's something to be aware of. Like, it's just like anything else in life. Like, you can get attached and elated about something,
yeah.
or you can tell yourself it was a nightmare and shouldn't have happened to you, just like anything else in life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So could you break down how exactly, like nerd out for us for a moment, how exactly psychedelics, and I know it's probably different with each psychedelics, but maybe you can give us, you know, psychedelics for dummies. How does it actually work in the brain? Like, what is it doing in our brain that makes trauma, for lack of a better phrase, easier to heal?
Well, it does depend on the psychedelic, but a few things that are somewhat consistent. So one thing is there's the default mode network, which is a series of brain regions, kind of mid structure to upper structure brain regions that kind of is where our rigid sense of self exists. It's also where rumination happens and kind of repetitive thinking and things. But that will loosen the grip of that connectivity. And when that happens, our rigid sense of self starts to dissolve. And so that's one thing where our rigid sense of self dissolves, and then what emerges in that space is a psychedelic.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, right? And so we can start to look at ourselves from a different angle. We can have non-ordinary experiences with the divine, lots of different things. Another thing with MDMA specifically, MDMA therapy, which is a really useful tool for trauma specifically when the trauma is very overwhelming inside of a person. And that's like the primary presentation. One of the interesting things about that tool is it basically inhibits the amygdala activity, which is a lot of where this fight and flight activity is coming from. So that gets inhibited, but then there's also sort of, because it's got stimulant, it's got this methamphetamine properties to it, that it also causes a lot of focus. And so we're able to like focus on trauma without usually the overwhelming fear response involved. I mean, it can get intense in an MDMA session, but you're often able to work with it in a kind of internally more supportive environment than you're used to. And then there's other things like many of these medicines, there's like a neurogenesis, neuroplasticity, the dendrites sprouting where new brain connectivity can happen. There's ketamine might have some anti-inflammatory effects on the brain. Ketamine's interesting because there's lots of research that some people who have been suffering from suicidal thinking for decades, during one session, it just goes away. That's crazy. Like, what is that? I mean, that's just insane, right? So I think that's kind of like the brief overview. And then I would also say we don't even know. We just don't know the whole story. We don't know the whole story. We don't know the whole story we know very little story about what consciousness is and how these ailments of consciousness essentially really work. You know, we don't know that much, but we know some things.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It's and the reason more and more research is happening. And before we were recording, we were talking about something that happened with the president to approve more research. Can you talk a little bit about specifically what that was about?
Yeah. So the president signed an executive order specifically aimed at psychedelic therapies. And it did a few things. One thing it did is it basically said we're going to give out, they created this voucher program recently where basically they can give some pharmaceutical companies a voucher to speed up their approval process very quickly. And so they said, look, we're going to give out 3 vouchers pretty much, I think, in the next handful of weeks to some companies that have psychedelic therapies in the pipeline and I think it was the director of the FDA, I don't remember, who said it's going to speed things up from years to weeks. So we could see, I don't think we'll see, we might see an approval within a couple months, but we'll probably see approvals by the end of the year because of this helping. It also said, hey, I forgot who does this, whether it's the Attorney General. It said, as soon as we have an FDA approval, you're going to immediately reschedule the drugs from Schedule 1 substances. So it speeds that up process. And then it also is devoting like $50 million or something to research with a specific medicine that is ibogaine that's being researched for traumatic brain injuries in veterans. And that's a research thing. But with all that said, we have a company that will be putting in their application for drug approval, Compass Pathways, for psilocybin therapy within probably weeks. And we hope to see them get approved this year or early next year. And then potentially MDMA got rejected in 2024, but let's see what happens from this executive order. A lot of people are speculating maybe MDMA is going to be back in the conversation with this executive order. So that's where we are.
I mean, it really goes to show that, you know, given in the right way with the right practitioners, these can be very helpful for things that people just really struggle with, because something that happens so often when someone has trauma is addiction. And could you talk a little bit about how certain psychedelics really help with addiction?
For sure. So basically, I wouldn't say it's the focus of psychedelic therapy research is addiction by any means. There are some small studies on smoking. There is a lot of conversation around ibogaine and opiate addiction because of the withdrawal process. It actually can help the withdrawal process. And then there's some small studies with ketamine and here and there. It's not a big sort of topic, I would say, in research. However, it's definitely something people have used to go through a big experience that has changed their life. You know, you can find lots of case studies of people saying, like, I was so stuck in addiction and I finally did this thing and it I was able to stop, whether it's psilocybin or so there's definitely conversation about it, and there's definitely some research. I think we're going to see some more research coming around addiction. I mean, I think that's next on the list of like a main focus area would be my guess. And then people who are in recovery, that's sort of a mixed bag in terms of, it's delicate. Some people really value psychedelic therapy in recovery for accessing trauma and things. And other people are like, oh, I'm in recovery, I can't do anything. So it's more of a delicate topic there, is what I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. I know a lot of things can be found in the book, but for someone who is considering, psychedelics as part of their healing program, can they get notable marked results in just one session?
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah.
It depends on the treatment protocol. Psilocybin could be 1 to 3 sessions, the treatment protocol. Ketamine is usually anywhere from 2 to 6 sessions. I'm just like kind of broadly speaking about protocols. MDMA tends to be 3 sessions. So it depends, but yeah, I mean, for sure, like we have lots of research that shows in ketamine, like I said, that like, in the first session, suicidal thinking could go away. So the answer is yes, you could get results. I think durability, like that it lasts over time, is where the integration comes in.
Yeah.
I mean, the work doesn't stop, obviously, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I did a ketamine journey, and it was 6 sessions, and it was so surprising because one thing that I really respect psychedelics and the right practitioners that hold the containers for them is sometimes what you think you're going in for and what you come out with are 2 different things. Yeah. I went in to deal with just to help. I've always been more of an anxious warrior, wired like that, overthinker, hypervigilant, but high performer. Yeah. And I went in thinking, I was going to deal with any trauma that was at the root of my hypervigilance and all that. But what I discovered through ketamine is that it actually was my maladaptive strategy of being a high achiever that was creating the stress on my nervous system, that was creating the hypervigilance. So something that I thought was just me and my personality was actually not me or my personality.
Are you still a high performer?
Not as high.
Not as high.
No, yeah. I think I do it more from a place of inspiration and true service and passion than compensation.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously I hear you. Like high performance can be a compensation strategy. I mean, sometimes it's like a hamster in a wheel. It's like, if I just run faster, I don't have to slow down to feel it.
Exactly.
Or I'll feel good about myself if I keep having achievements.
Yeah. And I think for high-performing people, that's often where the most fear around psychedelics is, because you don't want to break your brain, because it is the thing that is your greatest asset. And there's so many high performers, high-strung, people I've come across that I've really wanted to recommend psychedelics to. Like, no, I don't want to. Nothing's touching my brain.
I don't want to change. I don't want to lose that edge. I don't want to lose my edge. Yeah. I think ultimately integration is what people deeply want inside of them. And an integrated human being still has an edge. There's still a vision inside of them that's unattainable, that they'll keep going after if they're an integrated human being. So it may slow them down a little sometimes if you're a vigilant person.
Yes.
It might, but you'll feel better along the way if that happened.
Yeah. Well, and so much for me was just shifting my come from.
Yeah. Unfortunately for me, it never slowed me down, but that's just me.
Well, I also had a baby.
It didn't work.
That could have, having the baby probably slowed me down.
That's a different thing. That will definitely slow a mom down.
Yeah. Yes. Well, it's interesting because I did ketamine and a ketamine NAD stack right before I even knew I was going to get pregnant. We weren't planning on it or anything, but I actually think it was, they never really link psychedelics to fertility, but honestly, all the trauma work that I've done, both somatic and talk therapy and inner child and psychedelics, I truly believe it was one of the reasons I did not struggle with fertility. because,
Yeah.
As you said, the research on inflammation and all of that, it really does make a difference. Trauma, it can really wreak some havoc on our bodies. But the good news, as we're talking about, is there are ways to reprogram. We are neuroplastic. We are, regenerative. And what happened in childhood doesn't have to define the rest of your life.
Yeah. Well, there's definitely, I was just going to say,
yeah,
there's definitely plausible theories of like why a stress response would be linked to infertility, right? So obviously reducing stress responses in your body is potentially going to make you more fertile.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you want to be more fertile.
Yeah.
You might want to use stress as a way to not be fertile.
It's a great, man, stress. It does a number on us. Okay, I would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about microdosing because it's all over the place.
Right.
Can you talk about what microdosing is and what benefits we can get from it? And is it, safe? Are we doing drugs if we're microdosing? Let's talk a little bit about that.
Microdosing is a different strategy than psychedelic therapy levels dosing. Microdosing is taking a dose that's quite small that doesn't produce a psychedelic experience. So it's just a very small dose of the substance. Typically, people who are microdosing are using, so there's sort of the biohacking community who's not using it to necessarily treat mental health. They may be using it for creativity. There's Silicon Valley people doing that and other people where they're using it for like focus and creativity. And then there's people using it for mental health. The thing around this is that there's not enough research to say whether or not that does anything for mental health. The research just is not robust enough to claim that. There's, you look at one small study and it says maybe it helped a little. You look at another small study and it says like it was no better than the placebo. So I would just say we don't even know if it helps or not from a scientific inquiry perspective. Like to fully say that and hang your hat on that. But there's lots of people doing that. But the people who are doing it for mental health are either doing it multiple times a week or daily. That philosophy is no different, even though people might claim it is. I don't believe it's any different of a philosophy of why you would take an antidepressant every day. It's a philosophy of let me take a substance to reduce my symptoms, to make me feel better, but it's unlikely going to get to the root cause of what's, of what the issue is. It's going to, maybe give you a boost. So there's nothing wrong with that philosophy. I mean, I believe in psychiatric medications at the right time and place. But just like a psychiatric medications, we've become very over-reliant on reducing symptoms and not getting to the root cause.
Yeah.
And like psychiatric medications, they don't always work. Yeah. So that's what I'd say. It's a mixed bag.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's true. Like we said, there's no magic pill. You've got to deal with root cause. Like no supplement is going to make you feel better if you've got mold toxicity, and you're not dealing directly with that.
Yeah.
I microdose, not daily. I have found it. So we talked a little bit. I do not have the best sleeper as a child. Yeah. And I have found if I've been up with her multiple times of night, I'm super sleep deprived. So my neurotransmitters are probably lower. There's a certain blend that I can microdose that just helps me not lose my shit multiple times throughout the day.
Great. That's great.
What? And that's like better for my nervous system, better for my daughter's nervous system. And I'm super intentional about.
I know. Yeah, it's great. And I've heard a lot of those stories,
Yeah. And it's also like I've talked to a lot of my friends that are in the perimenopause journey with me when neurotransmitters are changing and you're just trying to get, a feel of like a new, because, we've been rhythmic and in a certain cycle for decades, and then that starts to change and it's like, whoa. So I really look at psychedelics or even antidepressants or those things kind of as a cast. If you have a broken bone, it's like the cast helps you heal, but you don't wear the cast forever. Eventually, like, and some people, depending on their trauma and whatever issue they have, they may need the cast for a lifetime. But it's really just being intentional about, not giving our power away to any pill or any drug. That's what I'm trying to say.
I agree.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. And it does work for people. I've heard anecdotal totally like lots of people swear by it.
Yeah.
And then again, we just don't know, does that work when you start hitting large populations of people with that method?
Right.
We just don't know.
Right. Well, maybe we will. Maybe more research will go towards it.
We'll know. We'll know eventually. There will be people. There's over 300 studies for psychedelics in the FDA right now. So there's a lot of going on.
Wow. Oh, it's so nice to have some good news about what's going on in the government.
Exactly.
It's more the rarity. So
yes, I know. It's strange. It's strange to even get good news.
I know, really.
But it happens sometimes.
That's why I asked you, was Joe Rogan really in the Oval Office, or was that some AI thing that I saw?
I know, it's funny. I mean, he was kind of, he's been a very big proponent of psychedelics and psychedelic therapy.
Oh, for sure, forever.
Yeah.
As we wrap up here, you're a psychotherapist, but also work as a coach. I'm a coach. Let's talk a little bit about, because I think a lot of times people have a misunderstanding of how coaching can be helpful, that, coaches just help you set goals and be accountable. And I'm sure you're like me, and that is not all you do. Can we talk about how coaching can really help with mental health?
Yeah. So I don't practice psychotherapy anymore. I only do coaching. I have been trained in a lot of different things, but I have one thing that I do a lot is DeMartini facilitation, which I don't know how much you know about John DeMartini. You know who that is.
Yeah. So no, my husband's was a huge fan of him for years.
Okay, yeah. So back in the day, I was, went pretty deep in training there with him. And anyways, there's a lot of things you could do as a coach to work with mental health in a way that's not psychotherapy. And I would say one of the primary ways is we have a lot of kind of fundamental thinking in our narratives about ourselves, that when we can identify those, there's a lot of polarities inside of the way we think about ourselves. And these go back to something I said before. It's like pride and shame splits, fantasy and nightmares about how we see the world. We can resolve those for people very quickly within a session, working on one at a time. So there's ways in which we can bring people back into more of a unity state, I think, pretty quickly, that can help mental health conditions. I think also just like actually having a knowledge base of mental health conditions, you can actually coach people around areas of life versus like, I'm treating your depression, but like we can deal with the root causes better as coaches. Mm-hmm. Like, okay, let me help you figure out how to, go get that mold treatment. Let's go figure out who's going to do that for you. So I think from my perspective, I think the more a coach can have a wide understanding of what causes people's obstacles, they're going to just be better at identifying them, referring certain things out, and then also helping them overcome certain things.
Yeah.
And obviously accountability is a huge factor. Coaches tend to do that a lot better than therapists.
Yep.
So accountability is a big factor in helping people take action, right?
Yeah.
Taking action is not easy. Behavior change is hard. And I think behavior change is another factor with coaching.
Yeah. I love that. That's why after my master's, I pursued coaching and not the clinician route or the license route. Well, I wanted the freedom to work with anyone all over the world. And then also just the accountability and the personal relationship. I love that. I love that piece of it as well. Yeah. And you also have the training of being a psychotherapist in your back pocket. So, useful bonus for people that work with you.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So you're actively taking clients right now. If people want to learn more about that, they can go to your website, which we'll link in the bio. Mm-hmm. We mentioned the book, and talk a little bit about your institute as well.
Yeah. So the Integrative Psychiatry Institute, we're one of the leaders of psychedelic therapy training specifically. We've trained closing on about 3,000 people in very comprehensive training, a lot more in smaller programs. But we're also, our whole kind of theme is integrative medicine training. So we're really trying to teach about the root causes of mental health struggles and then to train providers in how to actually identify and treat those things. So psychiatryinstitute.com is where that is. And lots of programs. And for people that aren't professionals, there is great stuff on there that they can go read blogs or podcast stuff and things like that.
And is that institute just local, or can anyone work with you from all over the world?
That's a global institute. We've trained close to 10,000 providers. It's usually about 15% of our providers are international. Our programs right now don't have any more in-person training. We used to have live in-person training, but now we do have some programs that still have live online training, but a lot of our programs are completely self-study.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. Well, this has been so wonderful. Such a great conversation. Anything I missed that you want to share before we sign off?
Well, there's always more fun things to talk about, but
Right.
I think you did a good job at, asking a lot of great questions.
Yeah,
so
there's only so much
we could leave it
in
there.
that.
We could obviously go for hours. But
okay. Yeah, for sure. This is a big topic. Well, thank you. Thank you for, first and foremost, your personal journey and your personal work. I always trust somebody more who's been in the trenches and is speaking from experience versus just from the mountaintop. So really appreciate the work that you're doing in the world. Taking on trauma is not an easy thing to, take on. And I love that we have more and more people and skilled practitioners and ways that we can really help people live a different life than the one they had in childhood. So it is possible. So today, I hope everybody, this gave you some hope, and do some research. If you've tried so many things and you really still feel very stuck, perhaps exploring some of the things we've talked about, just exploring, not doing, just exploring and researching is a great next step.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Keith.
Thank you for having me.